Bonjour, mes amis. Welcome back. I'm Christina from the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 49 of our read aloud together of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. It occurs to me that tomorrow is our 50th day. Maybe I'll try to do a golden tea of some sort since it's our 50th day of reading together. We should celebrate this, such a milestone. So let's start out today, though, with a not very golden tea. In fact, it is a blood orange tea. I thought, considering how dramatic this week's readings are, that we could use something that seemed equally dramatic in our tea. And besides, if there's a duel today, blood orange seemed quite appropriate. So let's see what happens in today's reading. Oh, it's been such a good week. And it's going to be such a good week of reading as well. Such a great week. Okay, let's take a sip of this tea. I love the fragrance on this one. It has that nice citrus flavor. Hello, Pam. Really, really good. So blood orange tea. I'm going to go right into the recap of yesterday's readings because today's reading is a little bit long. We're going to stretch out over an hour, but it's worth it. It really is. Okay, so in yesterday's readings, we read 3 chapters, chapters 87, 88, and 89. 87 was called The Challenge, and in that one it began with Beauchamp and Albert de Morcerf discussing, they had just finished a discussion of the trial in which Albert's father, the Count of Morcerf, had been convicted or found guilty by his peers of having been a traitor to the Ali Pasha, and of basically like not behaving honorably as a French military officer. And so afterwards, Beauchamp agrees to accompany Albert on his quest to find out who started this fact-finding, basically, about his father, like who exposed the shameful things his father had done so many years prior. And what Beauchamp reveals is that when he had been in Yanina, he had spoken to a banker there, and that banker said, "Oh yeah, somebody else was just asking me about this. I got a letter from another banker in France. His name was Danglars." And so Beauchamp and Albert go to the house of Baron Danglars, and Baron Danglars doesn't want to see him, but Albert kind of busts in, and basically they're talking about it. And at first the Baron Danglars tries to pretend that he doesn't know why Albert is upset at him, and he implies that perhaps Albert is upset because the engagement between his daughter and Albert has been broken off in favor of Eugenie Danglars marrying Andrea Cavalcanti. But Albert's like, no, that's not what it is. It's about my dad. And so what Danglars basically says is he tells Albert, I only knew to contact Yanina to write about your father because somebody else recommended that if I wanted to know about the source of his fortune, I should inquire there. And he's like, well, who told you to write to Yanina? And it's like, it was your own friend, the Count of Monte Cristo. So at this point, Albert starts to suspect that his friend may not be such a good friend. Danglars then says that, he had showed the contents of the letter he had gotten back from Yanina to the Count of Monte Cristo, and in fact he offers to show it to Albert and Beauchamp also, and he basically says he just wanted to find out the information. He has no interest, financial or otherwise, in destroying the reputation of Fernand Mondego, now the Count of Morcerf, and they believe him. So the two of them go then to see the Count of Monte Cristo. Or let me rephrase that. They try to go see the Count of Monte Cristo, but the Count of Monte Cristo is no longer receiving Albert. He says he's busy, he's taking a bath, after that he's going to have his nap, then he's going to dinner, but eventually he'll be at the opera that evening. So Albert makes plans to attend the opera, and he asks his friends, Beauchamp, Chateau Renaud, to be at the opera also, basically as his witnesses. And so he then retires home, and so that's chapter 88, The Insult. In that one, Albert goes home and he speaks with his mother, Mercédès, and he asks his mother, who are the enemies of the Count of Morcerf? And Mercédès is like, I don't know who your father's enemies would be. And he's like, well, what do you know about Monte Cristo? And at this point, Mercédès figures out there's something going on, that the Count of Monte Cristo was probably behind the expose of her husband as having been a dishonorable man in his earlier proceedings. And so she tries to convince Albert to not bother the Count of Monte Cristo, just like, he has been your friend, let him still be your friend. Do not start anything with the Count of Monte Cristo. But Albert's just like, absolutely not. You don't understand. And he won't talk about it with her. But he's like, you don't understand what's going on. What he doesn't understand is that she does know a bit about what's going on in the history about them. And so Albert then goes to the opera. When he goes to the opera that evening, eventually he sees the Count of Monte Cristo, who comes in accompanied by Maximilian Morel to his box. Albert goes over to that box with his friends, and he very loudly challenges and insults the Count of Monte Cristo. In fact, he is only restrained by Maximilian Morel, physically restrained by Maximilian Morel from throwing a glove against, like just like they do in cartoons, slapping the Count of Monte Cristo with his glove in order to issue a challenge. But Maximilian Morel stops him, but to no avail. The Count of Monte Cristo reaches across, takes the glove, the crumpled glove out of Albert's hands and says, I consider it thrown. Let me know when to meet you and with what weapons. Doesn't matter. I'll win. And so then shortly after, Beauchamp comes back and says, I think that my friend was a bit hasty. If you were to perhaps explain what was going on, I think we can work this out. I don't think there needs to be a duel. And the Count of Monte Cristo says, no, we're doing this thing. And so then they make the plans that they're going to meet the following morning. They'll use pistols, and they'll fight the duel. And then after Beauchamp leaves, after having made those arrangements, Maximilian Morel is just stunned, and he's a little surprised, perhaps a little horrified would be my impression, of watching the Count of Monte Cristo just totally put it out of his mind and just concentrate on the opera, because it matters so little to him that he's going to fight to the death and probably kill Albert de Morcerf on the following morning. Okay, so then that ends that chapter. In chapter 89, The Night, the Count of Monte Cristo goes home. He has Ali get out his practice pistol so he can practice shooting in his house, which apparently he does. And in comes a veiled woman. She takes off the veil and reveals that it is Mercédès. And she says to him, she starts out, Edmund, you will not kill my son. And this is the first time that he's been called by his name in decades. And he is stunned by hearing her call him Edmund. She says, call me Mercédès. He says, Mercédès is dead. And she's like, no, I'm here. And the two of them, he finally admits who he is, and they talk a bit. And she says, why are you trying to punish my husband? It's like these things were so past between us. And he says, what he did in Yanina was wrong. What he did while serving in the French military was wrong. What he did fighting against the Spanish, these were all wrong things. But what he did with us, that I need to punish. And he shows her the letter that he had, that so long ago had denounced him as a Bonapartist spy, or as an agent. And he shows her this letter, and he tells her that Danglars had penned the letter and Fernand had delivered it. And that had been the letter that had been written the day before they were to be married. The letter that ended up causing him to be incarcerated in the Chateau d'If. The letter that led ultimately to her marrying Fernand when he didn't come home, and that led to his father being left abandoned and starving to death in his own home. So this is why Edmond Dantes, now going as the Count of Monte Cristo, says he cannot forgive Fernand Mondego, and that if Fernand won't fight him, then the son will. He will fight the son. However, Mercédès, feeling the love of a mother, says, please, I beg of you, like I have always loved you. You were always, you were the one I wanted. I'm sorry that I didn't wait for you. I thought you were dead. But I have always loved and admired you, and please, I beg of you, do not kill my son. It's super dramatic. And so Edmond Dantes, remembering who he once was, agrees in that brief moment not to act as the Count of Monte Cristo, a creature of vengeance, an instrument of vengeance, if you will, that he will be Edmond Dantes for her. And he says, fine, I will not kill your son. So she cries grateful tears, and then he follows it up by saying, but if I don't kill your son, I will die tomorrow. And she's like, well, why does anyone have to die? And he's like, well, because a duel's been issued, your son challenged me, he insulted me, I can't let that live. My pride is such that I can't let that stand. And so if I'm not going to kill him, he will kill me tomorrow. And that's where the chapter ends, of basically Mercédès thanking the Count of Monte Cristo for sparing her son even at the cost of his own life. And so so then she leaves, and he is left alone. And he actually said, the chapter ends with him saying, let's go back to that line, him saying that, "What a fool I was not to tear my heart out on the day when I resolved to avenge myself." So even though so much has passed and he has changed in so many ways, even though Mercedes herself admits she's an older woman now, she's no longer his fiancée of so many years before, that he still has feelings that he cannot destroy her own happiness that much by killing her son. So it's actually very sweet, but it means that today there's going to be a duel between Albert de Morcerf and the Count of Monte Cristo, and we know that the Count is not going to fire against Albert. Okay, so it's time for some blood orange tea and perhaps a duel. We'll see what happens. We're going to read 3 chapters today. And we'll begin with chapter 90, The Meeting. After Mercedes had left Monte Cristo, he fell into profound gloom. Around him and within him, the flight of thought seemed to have stopped. His energetic mind slumbered, as the body does after extreme fatigue. "What?" said he to himself, while the lamp and the wax lights were nearly burnt out, and the servants were waiting impatiently in the anteroom. "What? This edifice, which I have been so long preparing, which I have reared with so much care and toil, is to be crushed by a single touch, a word, a breath. Yes, this self, of whom I thought so much, of whom I was so proud, who had appeared so worthless in the dungeons of the Chateau d'If, and whom I had succeeded in making so great, will be but a lump of clay tomorrow. Alas, it is not the death of the body I regret, for is not the destruction of the vital principle, the repose of which everything is tending, to which every unhappy being aspires, is not this the repose of matter after which I so long sighed, in which I was seeking to attain by the painful process of starvation, when Faria appeared in my dungeon? What is death for me? 1 step farther into rest, 2, perhaps, into silence. No. It is not existence, then, that I regret, but the ruin of projects so slowly carried out, so laboriously framed. Providence is now opposed to them when I most thought it would be propitious. It is not God's will that they should be accomplished. This burden, almost as heavy as a world, which I had raised, and I had thought to bear to the end, was too great for my strength, and I was compelled to lay it down in the middle of my career. Oh, shall I then again become a fatalist, whom 14 years of despair and 10 of hope had rendered a believer in Providence? And all this, because my heart, which I thought dead, was only sleeping, because it has awakened and has begun to beat again, because I have yielded to the pain of the emotion excited in my breast by a woman's voice. Yet, continued the Count, becoming each moment more absorbed in the anticipation of the dreadful sacrifice for the morrow, which Mercedes had accepted, yet it is impossible that so noble-minded a woman should thus, through selfishness, consent to my death when I am in the prime of life and strength. It is impossible that she can carry to such a point maternal love, or rather delirium. There are virtues which become crimes by exaggeration. No, she must have conceived some pathetic scene. She will come and throw herself between us, and what would be sublime here will there appear ridiculous. The blush of pride mounted to the Count's forehead as this thought passed through his mind. "Ridiculous?" repeated he, "and the ridicule will fall on me. I, ridiculous? No, I would rather die." By thus exaggerating to his own mind the anticipated ill fortune of the next day, to which he had condemned himself by promising Mercedes to spare her son, the Count at last exclaimed, "Folly, folly, folly! To carry generosity so far as to put myself up as a mark for that young man to aim at. He will never believe that my death was suicide, and yet it is important for the honor of my memory, and this surely is not vanity, but a justifiable pride. It is important the world should know that I have consented, by my free will, to stop my arm, already raised to strike, and that with the arm which has been so powerful against others, I have struck myself. It must be. It shall be. Seizing a pen, he drew a paper from a secret drawer in his desk and wrote at the bottom of the document, which was no other than his will, made since his arrival in Paris, a sort of codicil, clearly explaining the nature of his death. I do this, O my God, said he, with his eyes raised to heaven, as much for thy honor as for mine. I have during 10 years considered myself the agent of thy vengeance, and other wretches, like Morcerf, Danglars, Villefort, even Morcerf himself, must not imagine that chance has freed them from their enemy. Let them know, on the contrary, that their punishment, which had been decreed by Providence, is only delayed by my present determination, and although they escape it in this world, it awaits them in another, and that they are only exchanging time for eternity. While he was thus agitated by gloomy uncertainties, wretched waking dreams of grief, the first rays of morning pierced his windows and shone upon the pale blue paper on which he had just inscribed his justification of Providence. It was just 5 o'clock in the morning when a slight noise like a stifled sigh reached his ear. He turned his head, looked around him, and saw no one, but the sound was repeated distinctly enough to convince him of its reality. He arose, and quietly opening the door of the drawing-rooms, saw Haydée, who had fallen on a chair with her arms hanging down and her beautiful head thrown back. She had been standing at the door to prevent his going out without seeing her, until sleep, which the young cannot resist, had overpowered her frame. Wearied as she was with watching, the noise of the door did not awaken her, and Monte Cristo gazed at her with affectionate regret. She remembered that she had a son, said he, and I forgot I had a daughter. Then shaking his head sorrowfully, Poor Haydée, said he, she wished to see me, to speak to me. She has feared or guessed something. Oh, I cannot go without taking leave of her. I cannot die without confiding her to someone. He quietly regained his seat and wrote under the other lines, I bequeath to Maximilian Morrel, captain of Spahis, and son of my former patron, Pierre Morrel, shipowner at Marseille, the sum of 20 millions, a part of which may be offered to his sister Julie and brother-in-law Manuel, if he does not fear this increase of fortune may mar their happiness. These 20 millions are concealed in my grotto at Monte Cristo, of which Bertuccio knows the secret. If his heart is free, and he will marry Haydée, the daughter of Ali Pasha of Yanina, whom I have brought up with the love of a father, and who has shown the love and tenderness of a daughter for me, he will thus accomplish my last wish. This will has already constituted Haydée heiress of the rest of my fortune, consisting of lands, funds in England, Austria, and Holland, furniture in my different palaces and houses, and which, without the 20 millions and the legacies to my servants, may still amount to 60 millions. He was finishing the last line when a cry behind him made him start, and the pen fell from his hand. Haydée, said he, did you read it? Oh, my lord, said she, why are you writing thus at such an hour? Why are you bequeathing all your fortune to me? Are you going to leave me? I am going on a journey, dear child, said Monte Cristo, with an expression of infinite tenderness and melancholy. And if any misfortune should happen to me. The count stopped. Well, said the young girl, asked the young girl, with an authoritative tone the count had never observed before, and which startled him. Well, if any misfortune happened to me, replied Monte Cristo, I wish my daughter to be happy. Haydée smiled sorrowfully and shook her head. Do you think of dying, my lord? Said she. The wise man, my child, has said, it is good to think of death. Well, if you die, said she, bequeath your fortune to others, for if you die, I shall require nothing. And taking the paper, she tore it in 4 pieces and threw it into the middle of the room. Then, the effort having exhausted her strength, she fell, not asleep this time, but fainting on the floor. The count leaned over her and raised her in his arms, and seeing that sweet, pale face, those lovely eyes closed, that beautiful form motionless and to all appearance lifeless, the idea occurred to him for the first time that perhaps she loved him otherwise than as a daughter loves a father. Alas, murmured he with intense suffering, I might then have been happy yet. Then he carried Ide to her room, resigned her to the care of her attendants, and returning to his study, which he shut quickly this time, he again copied the destroyed will. As he was finishing, the sound of a cabriolet entering the yard was heard. Monte Cristo approached the window and saw Maximilian and Emmanuel alight. Good, said he, it was time, and he sealed his will with 3 seals. A moment afterwards he heard a noise in the drawing-room and went to open the door himself. Morrel was there. He had come 20 minutes before the time appointed. I am perhaps come too soon, Count, said he, but I frankly acknowledge that I have not closed my eyes all night, nor has anyone in my house. I need to see you strong in your courageous assurance to recover myself. Monte Cristo could not resist this proof of affection. He not only extended his hand to the young man, but flew to him with open arms. Morrel, said he, it is a happy day for me to feel that I am beloved by such a man as you. Good morning, Emmanuel. You will come with me then, Maximilian? Did you doubt it? Said the young captain. But if I were wrong? I watched you during the whole scene of that challenge yesterday. I have been thinking of your firmness all night, and I said to myself that justice must be on your side, or man's countenance is no longer to be relied on. But Morrel, Albert is your friend. Simply an acquaintance, sir. You met on the same day you first saw me? Yes, that is true, but I should not have recollected it if you had not reminded me. Thank you, Morrel. Then ringing the bell once, Look, said he to Ali, who came immediately. Take that to my solicitor. It is my will, Morrel. When I am dead, you will go and examine it. What? Said Morrel. You? Dead? Yes. Must I not be prepared for everything, dear friend? But what did you do yesterday after you left me? I went to Tortoni's, where, as I expected, I found Beauchamp and Chateau Renaud. I own I was seeking them. Why, when all was arranged? Listen, Count, the affair is serious and unavoidable. Did you doubt it? No, the offense was public, and everyone is already talking of it. Well, I hope to get an exchange of arms, to substitute the sword for the pistol. The pistol is blind. Have you succeeded? Asked Monte Cristo quickly, with an imperceptible gleam of hope. No, for your skill with the sword is so well known. Ah, who has betrayed me? The skillful swordsman whom you have conquered. And you failed? They positively refused. Morrel, said the Count, have you ever seen me fire a pistol? Never. Well, we have time. Look. Monte Cristo took the pistols he held in his hand when Mercédès entered, and fixing an ace of clubs against the iron plate, with 4 shots, he successively shot off the 4 sides of the club. At each shot, Morrel turned pale. He examined the bullets with which Monte Cristo performed this dexterous feat, and saw that they were no larger than buckshot. It is astonishing, said he. Look, Emmanuel. Then turning towards Monte Cristo, Count, said he, in the name of all that is dear to you, I entreat you not to kill Albert. The unhappy youth has a mother. You are right, said Monte Cristo, and I have none. These words were uttered in a tone which made Morrel shudder. You are the offended party, Count. Doubtless. What does that imply? That you will fire first. I fire first? Oh, I obtained, or rather claimed that. We had conceded enough for them to yield us that. And at what distance? 20 paces. And at what distance? 20 paces. A smile of terrible import passed over the Count's lips. Morrel, said he, do not forget what you have just seen. The only chance for Albert's safety, then, will arise from your emotion. I suffer from emotion, said Monte Cristo. Or from your generosity, my friend. To so good a marksman as you are, I may say what would appear absurd to another. What is that? Break his arm, wound him, but do not kill him. I will tell you, Morrel, said the Count, that I do not need entreating to spare the life of Monsieur de Morcerf. He shall be so well spared that he will return quietly with his 2 friends, while I... And you? That will be another thing. I shall be brought home. No, no, cried Maximilian, quite unable to restrain his feelings. As I told you, my dear Morel, Monsieur de Morcerf will kill me. Morel looked at him in utter amazement. But what has happened, then, since last night, Count? The same thing that happened to Brutus the night before the battle of Philippi. I have seen a ghost. And that ghost told me, Morel, that I had lived long enough. Maximilian and Emmanuel looked at each other. Monte Cristo drew out his watch. Let us go, said he. It is 5 minutes past 7, and the appointment was for 8 o'clock. A carriage was in readiness at the door. Monte Cristo stepped into it with his 2 friends. He had stopped a moment in the passage to listen at a door, and Maximilian and Emmanuel, who had considerately passed forward a few steps, thought they heard him answer by a sigh to a sob from within. As the clock struck 8, they drove up to the place of meeting. We are first, said Morel, looking out of the window. Excuse me, sir, said Baptistine, who had followed his master with indescribable terror. But I think I see a carriage down there, under the trees. Monte Cristo sprang lightly from the carriage and offered his hand to assist Emmanuel and Maximilian. The latter retained the Count's hand between his. I like, said he, to feel a hand like this, when its owner relies on the goodness of his cause. It seems to me, said Emmanuel, that I see 2 young men down there who are evidently waiting. Monte Cristo drew Morel a step or 2 behind his brother-in-law. Maximilian, said he, are your affections disengaged? Morel looked at Monte Cristo with astonishment. I do not seek your confidence, my dear friend. I only ask you a simple question. Answer it. That is all I require. I love a young girl, Count. Do you love her much? More than my life. Another hope defeated, said the Count. Then with a sigh, poor Haydée, murmured he. To tell the truth, Count, if I knew less of you, I should think that you were less brave than you are. Because I sigh when thinking of someone I am leaving? Come, Morel, it is not like a soldier to be so bad a judge of courage. Do I regret life? What is it to me, who have passed 20 years between life and death? Moreover, do not alarm yourself, Morel. This weakness, if it is such, is betrayed to you alone. I know the world is a drawing-room from which we must retire politely and honestly, that is, with a bow and our debts of honor paid. That is to the purpose. Have you brought your arms? Aye? What for? I hope these gentlemen have theirs. I will inquire, said Morel. Do, but make no treaty. You understand me? You need not fear. Morel advanced towards Beauchamp and Chateau Renaud, who, seeing his intention, came to meet him. The 3 young men bowed to each other courteously, if not affably. Excuse me, gentlemen, said Morel, but I do not see Monsieur de Morcerf. He sent us word this morning, replied Chateau Renaud, that he would meet us on the ground. Ah, said Morel. Beauchamp pulled out his watch. It is only 5 minutes past 8, said he to Morel. There is not much time lost yet. Oh, I make no illusion of that kind, replied Morel. There is a carriage coming, said Chateau Renaud. It advanced rapidly along one of the avenues leading towards the open space where they were assembled. You are doubtless provided with pistols, gentlemen? Monsieur de Monte Cristo yields his right of using his. We had anticipated this kindness on the part of the Count, said Beauchamp, and I have brought some weapons which I bought 8 or 10 days since, thinking to want them on a similar occasion. They are quite new and have not yet been used. Will you examine them? Oh, Monsieur Beauchamp, if you assure me that Monsieur de Morcerf does not know these pistols, you may readily believe that your word will be quite sufficient. Gentlemen, said Chateau Renaud, it is not Morcerf coming in that carriage. Faith, it is Franz and Debray. The 2 young men he announced were indeed approaching. What chance brings you here, gentlemen? Said Chateau Renaud, shaking hands with each of them. Because, said Debray, Albert sent this morning to request us to come. Beauchamp and Chateau Renaud exchanged looks of astonishment. I think I understand his reason, said Morel. What is it? Yesterday afternoon I received a letter from Monsieur de Morcerf begging me to attend the opera. And I, said Debray. And I also, said Franz. And we too, added Beauchamp and Chateau Renaud. Having wished you all to witness the challenge, he now wishes you to be present at the combat. Exactly so, said the young man. You have probably guessed right. But after all these arrangements, he does not come himself, said Chateau Renaud. Albert is 10 minutes after time. There he comes, said Beauchamp, on horseback, at full gallop, followed by a servant. How imprudent, said Chateau Renaud, to come on horseback to fight a duel with pistols after all the instructions I had given him. And besides, said Beauchamp, with a collar above his cravat, an open coat and white waistcoat, why has he not painted a spot upon his heart? It would have been more simple. Meanwhile, Albert had arrived within 10 paces of the group formed by the 5 young men. He jumped from his horse, threw the bridle on his servant's arms, and joined them. He was pale, and his eyes were red and swollen. It was evident that he had not slept. A shade of melancholy gravity overspread his countenance, which was not natural to him. I thank you, gentlemen, said he, for having complied with my request. I feel extremely grateful for this mark of friendship. Morel had stepped back as Morcerf approached and remained at a short distance. And to you also, Monsieur Morel, my thanks are due. Come, there cannot be too many. Sir, said Maximilian, you are not perhaps aware that I am Monsieur de Monte Cristo's friend? I was not sure, but I thought it might be so. So much the better. The more honorable men there are here, the better I shall be satisfied. Monsieur Morel, said Chateau Renaud, will you apprise the Count of Monte Cristo that Monsieur de Morcerf has arrived, and we are at his disposal? Morel was preparing to fulfill his commission. Beauchamp had meanwhile drawn the box of pistols from the carriage. Stop, gentlemen, said Albert. I have 2 words to say to the Count of Monte Cristo. In private? Asked Morel. No, sir, before all who are here. Albert's witnesses looked at each other. Franz and Debray exchanged some words in a whisper, and Morel, rejoiced at this unexpected incident, went to fetch the Count, who was walking in a retired path with Emmanuel. What does he want with me? Said Monte Cristo. I do not know, but he wishes to speak to you. Ah, said Monte Cristo, I trust he is not going to tempt me by some fresh insult. I do not think that such is his intention, said Morel. The Count advanced, accompanied by Maximilian and Emmanuel. His calm and serene look formed a singular contrast to Albert's grief-stricken face, who approached also, followed by the other 4 young men. When at 3 paces distant from each other, Albert and the Count stopped. Approach, gentlemen, said Albert. I wish you not to lose 1 word of what I am about to have the honor of saying to the Count of Monte Cristo, for it must be repeated by you to all who will listen to it, strange as it may appear to you. Proceed, sir, said the Count. Sir, said Albert, at first with a tremulous voice, but which gradually became firmer, I reproached you with exposing the conduct of Monsieur de Morcerf in Epirus. For guilty as I knew he was, I thought you had no right to punish him. But I have since learned that you had that right. It is not Fernand Mondego's treachery towards Ali Pasha which induces me so readily to excuse you, but the treachery of the fisherman Fernand towards you, and the almost unheard-of miseries which were its consequences. And I say, and proclaim it publicly, that you were justified in revenging yourself on my father, and I, his son, thank you for not using greater severity. Had a thunderbolt fallen in the midst of the spectators of this unexpected scene, it would not have surprised them more than did Albert's declaration. As for Monte Cristo, his eyes slowly rose towards heaven with an expression of infinite gratitude. He could not understand how Albert's fiery nature, of which he had seen so much among the Roman bandits, had suddenly stooped to this humiliation. He recognized the influence of Mercédès, and saw why her noble heart had not opposed the sacrifice she knew beforehand would be useless. Now, sir, said Albert, If you think my apology sufficient, pray, give me your hand. Next to the merit of infallibility which you appear to possess, I rank that of candidly acknowledging a fault. But this confession concerns me only. I acted well as a man, but you have acted better than man. An angel alone could have saved one of us from death. That angel came from heaven, if not to make us friends, which, alas, fatality renders impossible, at least to make us esteem each other. Monte Cristo, with moistened eye, heaving breast, and lips half open, extended to Albert a hand which the latter pressed with a sentiment resembling respectful fear. "Gentlemen," said he, "Monsieur de Monte Cristo receives my apology. I had acted hastily towards him. Hasty actions are generally bad ones. Now my fault is repaired. I hope the world will not call me cowardly for acting as my conscience dictated. But if anyone should entertain a false opinion of me," added he, drawing himself up as if he would challenge both friends and enemies, "I shall endeavor to correct his mistake." "What happened during the night?" asked Beauchamp of Chateau Renaud. "We appear to make a very sorry figure here." "In truth, what Albert has just done is either very despicable or very noble," replied the Baron. "What can it mean?" said Debray to Franz. "The Count of Monte Cristo acts dishonorably to Monsieur de Morcerf, and is justified by his son. Had I 10 Yaninas in my family, I should only consider myself the more bound to fight 10 times. As for Monte Cristo, his head was bent down, his arms were powerless. Bowing under the weight of 24 years' reminiscences, he thought not of Albert, of Beauchamp, of Chateau Renaud, or of any of that group, but he thought of that courageous woman who had come to plead for her son's life, to whom he had offered his, and who had now saved it by the revelation of a dreadful family secret, capable of destroying forever in that young man's heart every feeling of filial piety. "Providence still," murmured he. "Now only am I convinced of being the emissary of God." Okay, that concludes chapter 90. We have 2 more. Okay. Chapter 91, Mother and Son. The Count of Monte Cristo bowed to the 5 young men with a melancholy and dignified smile, and got into his carriage with Maximilian and Emmanuel. Albert, Beauchamp, and Chateau Renaud remained alone. Albert looked at his 2 friends, not timidly, but in a way that appeared to ask their opinion of what he had just done. "Indeed, my dear friend," said Beauchamp first, who had either the most feeling or the least dissimulation, "allow me to congratulate you. This is a very unhoped-for conclusion of a very disagreeable affair." Albert remained silent and wrapped in thought. Chateau Renaud contented himself with tapping his boot with his flexible cane. "Are we not going?" said he, after this embarrassing silence. "When you please," replied Beauchamp. "Allow me only to compliment Monsieur de Morcerf, who has given proof today of rare chivalric generosity." "Oh, yes," said Chateau Renaud. "It is magnificent," continued Beauchamp, "to be able to exercise so much self-control." "Assuredly. As for me, I should have been incapable of it," said Chateau Renaud with more significant coolness. "Gentlemen," interrupted Albert, "I think you did not understand that something very serious had passed between Monsieur de Monte Cristo and myself." Possibly," said Beauchamp immediately, "but every simpleton would not be able to understand your heroism, and sooner or later you will find yourself compelled to explain it to them more energetically than would be convenient to your bodily health and the duration of your life. May I give you a friendly counsel? Set out for Naples, The Hague, or St. Petersburg, calm countries where the point of honor is better understood than among our hot-headed Parisians. Seek quietude and oblivion so that you may return peaceably to France after a few years. Am I not right, Monsieur de Chateau Renaud?" "That is quite my opinion," said the gentleman. "Nothing induces serious duels so much as a duel forsworn." "Thank you, gentlemen," replied Albert with a smile of indifference. "I shall follow your advice, not because you give it, but because I had before intended to quit France. I thank you equally for the service you had rendered me in being my seconds. It is deeply engraved on my heart, and after what you have just said, I remember that only." Chateau Renaud and Beauchamp looked at each other. The impression was the same on both of them, and the tone in which Morcerf had just expressed his thanks was so determined that the position would have become embarrassing for all if the conversation had continued. "Goodbye, Albert," said Beauchamp suddenly, carelessly extending his hand to the young man. The latter did not appear to arouse from his lethargy. In fact, he did not notice the offered hand. "Goodbye," said Chateau Renaud in his turn, keeping his little cane in his left hand and saluting with his right. Albert's lips scarcely whispered "goodbye," but his look was more explicit. It expressed a whole poem of restrained anger, proud disdain, and generous indignation. He preserved his melancholy and motionless position for some time after his two friends had regained their carriage, then suddenly unfastening his horse from the little tree to which his servant had tied it, he mounted and galloped off in the direction of Paris. In a quarter of an hour he was entering the house in the Rue du Helder. As he alighted, he thought he saw his father's pale face behind the curtain of the Count's bedroom. Albert turned away his head with a sigh and went to his own apartments. He cast one lingering look on all the luxuries which had rendered life so easy and so happy since his infancy. He looked at the pictures, whose faces seemed to smile, and the landscapes, which appeared painted in brighter colors. Then he took away his mother's portrait with its oaken frame, leaving the gilt frame from which he took it black and empty. Then he arranged all his beautiful Turkish arms, his fine English guns, his Japanese china, his cups mounted in silver, his artistic bronzes by Foucher or Barye, examined the cupboards and placed the key in each, threw into a drawer of his secretaire, which he left open, all the pocket money he had about him, and with it the 1,000 fancy jewels from his vases and his jewel boxes. Then he made an exact inventory of everything and placed it in the most conspicuous part of the table after putting aside the books and papers which had collected there. At the beginning of this work his servant, notwithstanding orders to the contrary, came to his room. "What do you want?" asked he, with a more sorrowful than angry tone. "Pardon me, sir," replied the valet. "You had forgiven me to disturb you, but the Count of Morcerf has called me." "Well," said Albert, "I did not like to go to him without first seeing you." "Why?" "Because the Count is doubtless aware that I accompanied you to the meeting this morning." "It is probable," said Albert. "And since he has sent for me, it is doubtless to question me on what happened there. What must I answer?" "The truth." "Then I shall say the duel did not take place?" "You will say I apologized to the Count of Monte Cristo. Go." The valet bowed and retired, and Albert returned to his inventory. As he was finishing this work, the sound of horses prancing in the yard and the wheels of a carriage shaking his window attracted his attention. He approached the window and saw his father get into it and drive away. The door was scarcely closed when Albert bent his steps to his mother's room, and no one being there to announce him, he advanced to her bedchamber, and distressed by what he saw and guessed, stopped for one moment at the door. As if the same idea had animated these two beings, Mercédès was doing the same in her apartments that he had just done in his. Everything was in order. Laces, dresses, jewels, linen, money, all were arranged in the drawers, and the Countess was carefully collecting the keys. Albert saw all these preparations and understood them, and exclaiming, "My mother!" he threw his arms around her neck. The artist who could have depicted the expression of these two countenances would certainly have made of them a beautiful picture. All these proofs of an energetic resolution, which Albert did not fear on his own account, alarmed him for his mother. "What are you doing?" asked he. "What were you doing?" replied she. "Oh, my mother!" exclaimed Albert, so overcome he could scarcely speak. "It is not the same with you and me. You cannot have made the same resolution I have, for I have come to warn you that I bid adieu to your house, and to you." "I also," replied Mercédès, "am going, and I acknowledge I had depended on your accompanying me. Have I deceived myself?" "Mother," said Albert with firmness, "I cannot make you share the fate I have planned for myself. I must live henceforth without rank and fortune, and to begin this hard apprenticeship I must borrow from a friend the loaf I shall eat until I have earned one. So, my dear mother, I am going at once to ask Franz to lend me the small sum I shall require to supply my present wants." "You, my poor child, suffer poverty and hunger? Oh, do not say so. It will break my resolutions." "But not mine, mother," replied Albert. "I am young and strong. I believe I am courageous, and since yesterday I have learned the power of will. Alas, my dear mother, some have suffered so much, and yet live, and have raised a new fortune on the ruin of all the promises of happiness which heaven had made them, on the fragments of all the hope which God had given them. I have seen that, mother. I know that from the gulf in which their enemies have plunged them, they have risen with so much vigor and glory that in their turn they have ruled their former conquerors and have punished them. No, mother, from this moment I have done with the past, and accept nothing from it, not even a name, because you can understand that your son cannot bear the name of a man who ought to blush for it before another." "Albert, my child," said Mercédès, "if I had a stronger heart, that is the counsel I would have given you. Your conscience has spoken when my voice became too weak. Listen to its dictates. You had friends, Albert. Break off their acquaintance. But do not despair. You have life before you, my dear Albert, for you are yet scarcely 22 years old, and as a pure heart like yours wants a spotless name, take my father's. It was Herrera. I am sure, my dear Albert, whatever may be your career, you will soon render that name illustrious. Then, my son, return to the world still more brilliant because of your former sorrows, and if I am wrong, still let me cherish these hopes, for I have no future to look forward to. For me, the grave opens when I pass the threshold of this house." "I will fulfill all your wishes, my dear mother," said the young man. "Yes, I share your hopes. The anger of heaven will not pursue us, since you are pure and I am innocent. But since our resolution is formed, let us act promptly. Monsieur de Morcerf went out about half an hour ago. The opportunity is favorable to avoid an explanation." "I am ready, my son," said Mercédès. Albert ran to fetch a carriage. He recollected that there was a small furnished house to let in the Rue des Saints-Pères, where his mother would find a humble but decent lodging, and thither he intended conducting the Countess. As the carriage stopped at the door and Albert was alighting, a man approached and gave him a letter. Albert recognized the bearer. "From the Count," said Bertuccio. Albert took the letter, opened, and read it, then looked round for Bertuccio, but he was gone. He returned to Mercédès with tears in his eyes and heaving breast, and without uttering a word he gave her the letter. Mercédès read, "Albert, while showing you that I have discovered your plans, I hope also to convince you of my delicacy. You are free. You leave the Count's house, and you take your mother to your home. But reflect, Albert, you owe her more than your poor noble heart can pay her. Keep the struggle for yourself. Bear all the suffering, but spare her the trial of poverty which must accompany your first efforts. For she deserves not even the shadow of the misfortune which has this day fallen on her, and Providence is not willing that the innocent should suffer for the guilty. I know you are going to leave the Rue du Helder without taking anything with you. Do not seek to know how I discovered it. I know it. That is sufficient. Now listen, Albert. 24 years ago I returned, proud and joyful, to my country. I had a betrothed, Albert, a lovely girl whom I adored, and I was bringing to my betrothed 150 louis, painfully amassed by ceaseless toil. This money was for her. I destined it for her, and knowing the treachery of the sea, I buried our treasure in the little garden of the house my father lived in at Marseille, on the Allée de Mailhan. Your mother, Albert, knows that poor house well. A short time since I passed through Marseille and went to see the old place, which revived so many painful recollections, and in the evening I took a spade and dug in the corner of the garden where I had concealed my treasure. The iron box was there. No one had touched it, under a beautiful fig tree my father had planted the day I was born, which overshadowed the spot. Well, Albert, this money, which was formerly designed to promote the comfort and tranquility of the woman I adored, may now, through strange and painful circumstances, be devoted to the same purpose. Oh, feel for me, who could offer millions to that poor woman, but who returned her only the piece of black bread, forgotten under the poor roof since the day I was torn from her I loved. You are a generous man, Albert, but perhaps you may be blinded by pride or resentment. If you refuse me, if you ask another for what I have a right to offer you, I will say it is ungenerous of you to refuse the life of your mother, at the hands of a man whose father was allowed by your father to die in all the horrors of poverty and despair. Albert stood pale and motionless to hear what his mother would decide after she had finished reading this letter. Mercédès turned her eyes with an ineffable look towards heaven. I accept it, said she. He has a right to pay the dowry, which I shall take with me to some convent. Putting the letter in her bosom, she took her son's arm, and with a firmer step than she even herself expected, she went downstairs. Okay, last chapter of the day, chapter 92, the suicide. Meanwhile, Monte Cristo had also returned to town with Emmanuel and Maximilian. Their return was cheerful. Emmanuel did not conceal his joy at the peaceful termination of the affair, and was loud in his expressions of delight. Morrel, in a corner of the carriage, allowed his brother-in-law's gaiety to expend itself in words, while he felt equal inward joy, which, however, betrayed itself only in his countenance. At the Barrière du Trône, they met Bertuccio, who was waiting there, motionless as a sentinel at his post. Monte Cristo put his head out of the window, exchanged a few words with him in a low tone, and the steward disappeared. Count, said Emmanuel when they were at the end of the Place Royale, put me down at my door, that my wife may not have a single moment of needless anxiety on my account or yours. If I were not ridiculous to make a display of our triumph, said Morrel, I would invite the Count to our house. Besides that, he doubtless has some trembling heart to comfort. So we will take leave of our friend and let him hasten home. Stop a moment, said Monte Cristo. Do not let me lose both my companions. Return, Emmanuel, to your charming wife, and present my best compliments to her. And do you, Morrel, accompany me to the Champs-Élysées? Willingly, said Maximilian, particularly as I have business in that quarter. Shall we wait breakfast for you? Asked Emmanuel. No, replied the young man. The door was closed, and the carriage proceeded. See what good fortune I brought you, said Morrel, when he was alone with the Count. Have you not thought so? Yes, said Monte Cristo. For that reason I wished to keep you near me. It is miraculous, continued Morrel, answering his own thoughts. What? Said Monte Cristo. What has just happened? Yes, said the Count. You are right. It is miraculous. For Albert is brave, resumed Morrel. Very brave, said Monte Cristo. I have seen him sleep with a sword suspended over his head. And I know he has fought 2 duels, said Morrel. How can you reconcile that with his conduct this morning? All owing to your influence, replied Monte Cristo, smiling. It is well for Albert he is not in the army, said Morrel. Why? An apology on the ground, said the young captain, shaking his head. Come, said the Count mildly, do not entertain the prejudices of ordinary men, Morrel. Acknowledge that if Albert is brave, he cannot be a coward. He must then have had some reason for acting as he did this morning, and confess that his conduct is more heroic than otherwise. Doubtless, said Morrel. But I shall say, like the Spaniard, he has not been so brave today as he was yesterday. You will breakfast with me, will you not, Morrel? Said the Count, to turn the conversation. No, I must leave you at 10 o'clock. Your engagement was for breakfast, then? Said the Count. Morrel smiled and shook his head. Still, you must breakfast somewhere. But if I am not hungry, said the young man. Oh, said the Count, I only know 2 things which destroy the appetite, grief, and as I am happy to see you are very cheerful, it is not that, and love. Now, after what you told me this morning of your heart, I may believe... Well, Count, replied Morrel gaily, I will not dispute it. But you will not make me your confidant, Maximilian, said the Count, in a tone which showed how gladly he would have been admitted to the secret. I showed you this morning that I had a heart, did I not, Count? Monte Cristo only answered by extending his hand to the young man. Well, continued the latter, since that heart is no longer with you in the Bois de Vincennes, it is elsewhere, and I must go and find it. Go, said the Count deliberately. Go, dear friend, but promise me, if you meet with any obstacle, to remember that I have some power in this world, that I am happy to use that power in the behalf of those I love, and that I love you, Morrel. I will remember it, said the young man, as selfish children recollect their parents when they want their aid. When I need your assistance, and the moment arrives, I will come to you, Count. Well, I rely upon your promise. Goodbye, then. Goodbye, till we meet again. They had arrived in the Champs-Élysées. Monte Cristo opened the carriage door. Morrel sprang out on the pavement. Bertuccio was waiting on the steps. Morrel disappeared down the Avenue de Marigny, and Monte Cristo hastened to join Bertuccio. Well, asked he. She is going to leave her house, said the steward. And her son? Florentine, his valet, thinks he is going to do the same. Come this way. Monte Cristo took Bertuccio into his study, wrote the letter we have seen, and gave it to the steward. Go, said he quickly, but first let Haydée be informed that I have returned. Here I am, said the young girl, who at the sound of the carriage had run downstairs, and whose face was radiant with joy at seeing the Count return safely. Bertuccio left, every transport of a daughter finding a father, all the delight of a mistress seeing an adored lover, were felt by Haydée during the first moments of this meeting, which she had so eagerly expected. Doubtless, although less evident, Monte Cristo's joy was not less intense. Joy to hearts which have suffered long is like the dew on the ground after a long drought. Both the heart and the ground absorb that beneficent moisture falling on them, and nothing is outwardly apparent. Monte Cristo was beginning to think, what he had not for a long time dared to believe, that there were two Mercédès in the world, and he might yet be happy. His eye, elate with happiness, was reading eagerly the tearful gaze of Haydée, when suddenly the door opened. The Count knit his brow. Monsieur de Morcerf, said Baptistine, as if that name sufficed for his excuse. In fact, the Count's face brightened. Which? asked he, the Viscount or the Count? The Count. Oh! exclaimed Haydée, is it not yet over? I know not if it is finished, my beloved child, said Monte Cristo, taking the young girl's hands, but I do know you have nothing more to fear. But it is the wretched... That man cannot injure me, Haydée, said Monte Cristo. It was his son alone that there was cause to fear. And what I have suffered, said the young girl, you shall never know, my lord. Monte Cristo smiled. By my father's tomb, said he, extending his hand over the head of the young girl, I swear to you, Haydée, that if any misfortune happens, it will not be to me. I believe you, my lord, as implicitly as if God had spoken to me, said the young girl, presenting her forehead to him. Monte Cristo pressed on that pure, beautiful forehead a kiss which made two hearts throb at once, the one violently, the other secretly. Oh, murmured the Count, shall I then be permitted to love again? Ask Monsieur de Morcerf into the drawing-room, said he to Baptistine, while he led the beautiful Greek girl to a private staircase. We must explain this visit, which, although expected by Monte Cristo, is unexpected to our readers. While Mercédès, as we have said, was making a similar inventory of her property to Albert's, while she was arranging her jewels, shutting her drawers, collecting her keys to leave everything in perfect order, she did not perceive a pale and sinister face at the glass door, which threw light into the passage, from which everything could be both seen and heard. He who was thus looking, without being heard or seen, probably heard and saw all that passed in Madame de Morcerf's apartments. From that glass door, the pale-faced man went to the Count's bedroom and raised with a constricted hand the curtain of a window overlooking the courtyard. He remained there 10 minutes, motionless and dumb, listening to the beating of his own heart. For him, those 10 minutes were very long. It was then Albert, returning from his meeting with the Count, perceived his father watching for his arrival behind a curtain, and turned aside. The Count's eye expanded. He knew Albert had insulted the Count dreadfully, and that in every country in the world such an insult would lead to a deadly duel. Albert returned safely. Then the Count was revenged. An indescribable ray of joy illumined that wretched countenance like the last ray of the sun before it disappears behind the clouds which bear the aspect, not of a downy couch, but of a tomb. But as we have said, he waited in vain for his son to come to his apartment with the account of his triumph. He easily understood why his son did not come to see him before he went to avenge his father's honor, but when that was done, why did not his son come and throw himself into his arms? It was then, when the Count could not see Albert, that he sent for his servant, who he knew was authorized not to conceal anything from him. 10 minutes afterwards, General Morcerf was seen on the steps in a black coat with a military collar, black pantaloons, and black gloves. He had apparently given previous orders, for as he reached the bottom step, his carriage came from the coach-house, ready for him. The valet threw into the carriage his military cloak, in which 2 swords were wrapped, and shutting the door, he took his seat by the side of the coachman. The coachman stooped down for his orders. "To the Champs-Élysées," said the general, "the Count of Monte Cristo's. Hurry." The horses bounded beneath the whip, and in 5 minutes they stopped before the Count's door. Monsieur de Morcerf opened the door himself, and as the carriage rolled away, he passed up the walk, rang, and entered the open door with his servant. A moment afterwards, Baptistine announced the Count of Morcerf to Monte Cristo, and the latter, leading Haydée aside, ordered that Morcerf be asked into the drawing-room. The general was pacing the room the 3rd time, when in turning he perceived Monte Cristo at the door. "Ah, it is Monsieur de Morcerf," said Monte Cristo quietly. "I thought I had not heard aright." "Yes, it is I," said the Count, whom a frightful contraction of the lips prevented from articulating freely. "May I know the cause which produces me the pleasure of seeing Monsieur de Morcerf so early?" "Had you not a meeting with my son this morning?" asked the general. "I had," replied the Count. "And I know my son had good reasons to wish to fight with you, and to endeavor to kill you." "Yes, sir, he had very good ones, but you see that in spite of them, he has not killed me, and did not even fight." "Yet he considered you the cause of his father's dishonor, the cause of the fearful ruin which has fallen on my house." "It is true, sir," said Monte Cristo with his dreadful calmness. "A secondary cause, but not the principal." "Doubtless you made, then, some apology or explanation?" "I explained nothing. It is he who apologized to me." "And to what do you attribute this conduct?" "To the conviction, probably, that there was one more guilty than I." "And who was that?" "His father." "That may be," said the Count, turning pale, "but you know the guilty do not like to find themselves convicted." "I know it, and I expected this result." "You expected my son would be a coward?" cried the Count. "Albert, or Monsieur Albert de Morcerf, is no coward," said Monte Cristo. "A man who holds a sword in his hand and sees a mortal enemy within reach of that sword and does not fight is a coward. Why is he not here that I may tell him so?" "Sir," replied Monte Cristo coldly, "I did not expect that you had come here to relate to me your little family affairs. Go and tell Monsieur Albert that, and he may know what to answer you." "Oh, no, no," said the general, smiling faintly. "I did not come for that purpose. You are right. I came to tell you that I also look upon you as my enemy. I came to tell you that I hate you instinctively, that it seems as if I had always known you and always hated you. And in short, since the young people of the present day will not fight, it remains for us to do so. Do you think so, sir?" "Certainly. And when I told you I had foreseen the result, it is the honor of your visit I alluded to." "So much the better. Are you prepared?" "Yes, sir." You know that we shall fight till one of us is dead, said the general, whose teeth were clenched with rage. Until one of us dies, repeated Monte Cristo, moving his head slightly up and down. Let us start then. We need no witnesses. Very true, said Monte Cristo. It is unnecessary. We know each other so well. On the contrary, said the count, we know so little of each other. Indeed, said Monte Cristo, with the same indomitable coolness. Let us see. Are you not the soldier Fernand, who deserted on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo? Are you not the Lieutenant Fernand, who served as guide and spy to the French army in Spain? Are you not the Captain Fernand, who betrayed, sold, and murdered his benefactor Ali? And have not all these Fernands, united, made Lieutenant General the Count of Morcerf, peer of France? Oh, cried the general, as if branded with a hot iron. Wretch, to reproach me with my shame when about, perhaps, to kill me. No, I did not say I was a stranger to you. I know well, demon, that you have penetrated into the darkness of the past, and that you have read, by the light of what torch I know not, every page of my life. But perhaps I may be more honorable in my shame than you under your pompous coverings. No, I am aware you know me, but I know you only as an adventurer sewn up in gold and jewelry. You call yourself in Paris the Count of Monte Cristo, in Italy Sinbad the Sailor, in Malta I forget what. But it is your real name I want to know, in the midst of your 100 names, that I may pronounce it when we meet to fight, at the moment when I plunge my sword through your heart. The Count of Monte Cristo turned dreadfully pale. His eyes seemed to burn with a devouring fire. He leapt towards a drawing-room near his bedroom, and in less than a moment, tearing off his cravat, his coat and waistcoat, he put on a sailor's jacket and hat, from beneath which rolled his long black hair. He returned thus, formidable and implacable, advancing with his arms crossed on his breast toward the general, who could not understand why he had disappeared, but who, on seeing him again and feeling his teeth chatter and his legs sink under him, drew back, and only stopped when he found a table to support his clenched hand. "Fernand," cried he, "of my 100 names I need only tell you one to overwhelm you. But you guess it now, do you not? Or rather, you remember it. For notwithstanding all my sorrows and my tortures, I show you today a face which the happiness of revenge makes young again. A face you must often have seen in your dreams since your marriage with Mercédès, my betrothed." The general, with his head thrown back, hands extended, gaze fixed, looked silently at this dreadful apparition. Then, seeking the wall to support him, he glided along close to it until he reached the door, through which he went out backwards, uttering this single, mournful, lamentable, distressing cry, "Edmond Dantès!" Then, with sighs which were unlike any human sound, he dragged himself to the door, reeled across the courtyard, and falling into the arms of his valet, he said in a voice scarcely intelligible, "Home, home." The fresh air and the shame he felt at having exposed himself before his servants partly recalled his senses. But the ride was short, and as he drew near his house, all his wretchedness revived. He stopped at a short distance from the house and alighted. The door was wide open. A hackney coach was standing in the middle of the yard, a strange sight before so noble a mansion. The Count looked at it with terror, but without daring to inquire its meaning, he rushed towards his apartment. 2 persons were coming down the stairs. He had only time to creep into an alcove to avoid them. It was Mercédès, leaning on her son's arm and leaving the house. They passed close by the unhappy being, who, concealed beneath the damask curtain, almost felt Mercédès' dress brush past him, and his son's warm breath pronouncing these words, "Courage, mother. Come, this is no longer our home." The words died away. The steps were lost in the distance. The general drew himself up, clinging to the curtain. He uttered the most dreadful sob which ever escaped from the bosom of a father abandoned at the same time by his wife and son. He soon heard the clatter of the iron step of the hackney coach, then the coachman's voice, and then the rolling of the heavy vehicle shook the windows. He darted to his bedroom to see once more all he had loved in the world. But the hackney coach drove on, and the head of neither Mercedes nor her son appeared at the window to take a last look at the house or the deserted father and husband. And at the very moment when the wheels of that coach crossed the gateway, a report was heard, and a thick smoke escaped through one of the panes of the window, which was broken by the explosion. So, that concludes chapter 92 of The Count of Monte Cristo. So it turns out that the blood orange tea, or the blood shed today, was that of Fernand Mondego, and not that of his son Albert or of the Count of Monte Cristo during the duel. Thank you for joining me for today's readings. Tomorrow we will read only 2 chapters. It'll be a much shorter reading, but it'll conclude our super exciting week of reading, and then we'll have just 2 more weeks left of our book. Start thinking too of what books you might like to read next. That was just so exciting. This is why I had to drink only decaffeinated tea today. That was so exciting. Okay, thank you very much. I'm so glad you were able to join me today, and I will see you next time for more chapters from The Count of Monte Cristo. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.